In the wake of Donald's Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden in New York City, I had the privilege of speaking with Lawrence O'Donnell, not just about some of the things that Donald said in the rally, but about Donald's state of mind leading up to the most consequential election, not just of our lifetimes, but certainly of his. In his opening monologue, Lawrence talked about the cowardice of the Republican Party and how cowardice has actually become part of the Republican brand. He said, quote, "They're now afraid of everybody who does not vote for Donald Trump." This is true. And that's why Donald is the perfect avatar for this party, because he is afraid of everything, especially of facing the truth about himself, that most egregiously, he's a loser, that he's entirely unworthy, and he's even more afraid of having that truth revealed to the world. How is it possible, though, that so many people could be enthralled to such a weak, dysfunctional, and incompetent person? So that led me to suggest the following.
The only thing that matters to them is Donald's version of things. And time again, and this has been going on for years now, but it's only getting more extreme, he proves the truism that fragile systems bend towards their most dysfunctional member, and that's always him.
Lawrence reminded me that during the rally, Donald had talked about the differences between the New York City subway system today versus how it used to be in the past.
My parents would drop me off at a subway, and I'd go to Union Turnpike, or I'd go to wherever They had no fear that I was going to be disappearing. They would take me to a subway, put me on, and say, "Bye, darling, bye." If you do that today, you have about a 75% chance that you'll never see your child again. What the hell has happened here?
Well, yeah, that's how it was in the past. I started taking the subway when I was 11, and I actually walked to the subway station by myself. That's kind of the point. After I left in the morning to go to school, neither one of my parents had any idea what I was doing, who I was with, or where I was until I came home in the afternoon or evening. Unconsciously, though, Donald is revealing something else here. Here's what I told Lawrence.
Donald feels like he is losing his grip. He knows on a very deep level that he is not in control. And I think he's beginning to suspect that he never has been. And that goes back to these very, very old and deep pathologies. And with the subway incident, that was normal. And yeah, he would have walked because it was only like 6 blocks from my grandparents' house to the subway on Hillside Avenue and 179th Street. But he also, there's a bit of grievance there, as if he feels like they abandoned him somehow. So the thing about Donald Trump that is so remarkable is that he is the same person now as he was then, but the fears, the grievances, and the incapacity to contain any of it has worsened over time.
Lawrence and I also spoke about the Republican Party's hypocrisy on immigration. As you probably know, Donald's first wife was an immigrant. His current wife is an immigrant. Both of his grandparents on his father's side were immigrants. And his mother, my grandmother, was an immigrant. And I just want to point this out because I think it's important. My grandfather, again, both of whose parents were immigrants from Germany, was an anchor baby. So it's a very fine line to walk when your platform seems to be about 90% about anti-immigrant hatred. But Donald's very good at convincing people that his behavior does not matter. Back in the 80s, whenever he was asked about his heritage, he would lie because he and my grandfather thought that admitting that he was German or had a German background would make it harder for them to do business with New York City real estate people who were Jewish. So he would lie and say that he was Swedish, which is very weird because His mother's 100% Scottish. He could have told the truth and said that he was Scottish. But that completely unnecessary lie reveals something about Donald's relationship with his mother. And it's that she was completely irrelevant to him. I honestly think that we are completely beyond the point where Donald's lies about his own family history and the fact that he's married to immigrants is going to make a difference. It is indeed one of those things that the corporate media keeps telling us is baked in. But one of the most vicious of the many, many vicious things that was said at Donald's rallies should make a difference. And it was said by an alleged comedian having to do with immigrants and procreation. Take a look at this.
I welcome migrants to the United States of America with open arms. And by open arms, I mean like this. It's wild. And these Latinos, they love making babies too. Just know that. They do. They do. There's no pulling out. They don't do that. They come inside, just like they did to our country. Republicans are the party with a good sense of humor.
Well, okay, if you think that's an argument, how about this? The truth of the matter is, my grandmother was the youngest of 10 children. Donald was one of 5 children. Donald himself has 5 children. And I would argue that the only reason he married Melania is because when he met her, he only had 4 kids. And he needed to match my grandfather and have another one. Also, Donald's oldest kid has 5 children. So make of that what you will. Then Lawrence played a clip from the rally that I actually hadn't seen before. And I have to admit, I found it a little bit unnerving. So take a look.
My father's looking down on me right now. He was a tough guy, but he was like legit. And I know my mother's in heaven. I'm not 100% sure of my father, but it's close. But he's looking down at me right now. And he's saying, how the hell did this happen to my son?
Mary Trump, what's he talking about?
Oh, Lawrence, truer words, truer words. Yeah, Donald's always telling on himself.
Besides the fact that that's a pretty strange and personal thing to say in the middle of a campaign rally, it turns out that what Donald says there explains a lot about his current state of mind.
If my grandfather knew that Donald had sold Fred Trump's real estate empire lock, stock, and barrel in 2004, Donald knows exactly what my grandfather would have to say to him. And the difference is that because Donald basically, and I don't mean to generate any sympathy for the man because he deserves none, but was shaped by a sociopath. Donald himself, who has been desperate for love his whole life, but because of his father, has been rendered incapable of being loved, is a nihilist. So he doesn't believe that anything can survive beyond him. There is no legacy. And he's trapped in this very dark and twisted vision of what the world is.
If you didn't know what the relationship between my grandfather and Donald was like in the context of my family, you might think that he adored Donald, right? You might think that he put Donald on a pedestal and thought that he legitimately believed that Donald was an entrepreneurial genius who far outpaced him. And that's actually how my grandfather presented it in public. I mean, don't get me wrong. Although none of that is true, what is true is that my grandfather did treat Donald exceptionally well and much, much better than any of his other children, his wife, or anybody else in the family. The bottom line is my grandfather was a sociopath. And even Donald, like his other children, existed only to be of use to him. So if he couldn't find a use for you, whether you were his child or his grandchild or somebody else in the world, you would be discarded, you'd be ignored, or much worse. Donald served one purpose for Fred, and he served it very well for a very long time. And that was to do what my grandfather believed my father couldn't do: keep his empire running in perpetuity. Let me be clear about what that means, because Donald never ran my grandfather's empire. What he did was expand the brand of the Trump name, which redounded to the benefit of my grandfather's empire, right? So take a look at this.
My grandfather was the person who had the most influence on Donald, who's the person who's most responsible for creating this person before us. And there's a very significant difference between the two, though. My grandfather cared about nothing but his empire and its legacy. For very complicated reasons, he decided that my dad, the oldest son and namesake, was not the person to carry that on. He decided it was Donald.
After Fred died, Donald once again found himself desperate for money, despite the fact that over the course of his lifetime, my grandfather had thrown almost $500 million at his second son. But within 5 years of my grandfather's death, Donald sold Fred's empire lock, stock, and barrel at a loss of almost $300 million. My family no longer owns a single Trump building that was built by my grandfather in Brooklyn and Queens over decades. The empire my grandfather spent a lifetime amassing is gone completely. So Donald knows exactly what my grandfather would say to him: "You're a piece of shit."
And one thing we know, or should know by now, is that when Donald says things like that, or especially when Donald speaks in those self-aggrandizing ways, the best, the greatest, the most fantastic, he's speaking to an audience of one, and that's my grandfather, who's been dead since 1999.
Knowing Donald was in the White House, knowing that he's running again for the presidency, would matter not at all to Fred Trump. Fred Trump cared only about his empire and his legacy, and Donald was merely an asset that would have lost all value as soon as he failed to hold up his end of the bargain. Despite hundreds of millions of dollars being thrown at him, despite the fact that my grandfather elevated Donald above all of his other children, through my grandfather's viciousness and his sociopathy and his transactional approach to all relationships, including relationships with his own children, Donald was left with a gaping void where his confidence and sense of self should be. The man who believed in his legacy created a man who believes in nothing. A man who cannot comprehend that the world could possibly exist beyond him. That's Donald. And for the last decade, tens of millions of people in this country have been in thrall to Donald's dark, terrifying, nihilistic vision.